you're ready.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Apologize that we're a few minutes late today. We just needed some additional time to get everything set up. My name is Jeanette Wurzbicki. I am the Executive Director of the Ohio Mideastern Governments Association. We're the local development district that serves 10 counties in the Eastern Appalachian region of Ohio, to include Belmont County. And we received funding a couple years ago from the Economic Development Administration to help our region recover economically from the pandemic. One of the tasks that we all knew was extremely important was to have the availability of high-speed, reliable broadband to all of our residents. So we decided to use the funding from EDA to do a region-wide broadband feasibility study. And what we're here today is to present some preliminary results of our study, which will be finalized in the next couple months, and really to seek public input on your needs, answer any questions that you may have. The intent is really to develop a roadmap for extending broadband to all of the unserved areas. And we do know that Belmont County has been very fortunate to be working with Ohio Gig on extending fiber to the home. We did retain Reid Consulting Group to do our broadband feasibility study. And with me here today is Sean O'Malley to present some of the results today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Sean.
Thank you, Jeanette. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to thank Omega for providing funding for this through their EDA contract. Also, we are working with neighboring development districts, Buckeye Hills, OVRDC, and Eastgate. Without these folks, this would not be possible. We also have a number of other funding partners across the state. This is important work. We are glad that folks recognize that. This is really about positioning our region for the win. I apologize for the Bengals reference. We're awfully close to Pittsburgh and Cleveland up here. But Joey Burrow is a hometown boy. Grew up in Athens, went to school with my kids, so high school with my kids, so I think I can get away with it. But to set ourselves up for the win, we need to identify where the problems are. We need to prioritize which places we want to try to reach, and then we need to secure funding for them. And finally, most importantly, we need to track that funding and enforce it. As we'll see in a moment, as I give some of the historical context, not all of the federal programs especially have been good about enforcing the requirements of actually doing the work after the money was handed out. I'll be starting at a state level and then kind of narrowing down to Omega's district and then down to Belmont County itself. If any of you have participated in earlier meetings with me, some of this material will sound familiar to you, but I know there will be folks in here who are seeing this for the first time, and so I did not want to leave out any of the context. So statewide, it's pretty startling. All of the red and orange on this map is considered unserved by the FCC standards. So all of those areas of the state are unable to get anything that is faster than 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up. And much of it is below 10 megabits per second, which is quite slow these days. The yellow areas and the light green now also are considered underserved based on the new federal infrastructure legislation that was just passed recently. So pretty much only the really dark patches, dark green patches, are the ones that are considered well served right now. And as you can see on there, it's just bits and pieces of Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Cleveland, Akron, Canton area, a little bit over in Youngstown. And if we zoomed in, you'd be able to see small bits of coverage, census block by census block in some of the smaller cities. But vast majority of the state is not well served right now. This is based in part on over 9 million consumer speed tests. So if you've ever checked to see how fast your internet was and you Googled speed test, the tool that you got was probably the one that's provided by a company called Ookla. They are the biggest company that do speed testing right now. And the state of Ohio, very smart move here, they licensed a year and a half worth of the speed test results data from Ookla and gave us access to that, so we were able to use that to inform our mapping to identify where there is actual coverage and where there isn't. It's important for folks to still take speed tests, and it doesn't matter whether your connection is good or bad. We want you to take it either way because we want as accurate a picture as we can. As we move forward later, as I talk about enforcement, you'll see the importance of that. To look at the numbers real quick, you want to be looking at these unserved sections in this table. So when you combine the below 10 and below 25.3, you're looking at about 2/3 of the state's populated acreage, and about 800,000 households do not have broadband right now. If you ask the FCC, they think it's only 200,000 households. Recently, they finally admitted that the maps they were using for that were wrong, that they way understated the problem. If you ask Microsoft on the other end, they think there are 2 million households in Ohio who don't have broadband. Why is this happening? This basically comes down to population density. If you look at a city, for example, Columbus, you've got about 1,500 households per square mile. Even when you go down to a smaller city like McConnellsville, you're still almost at 500 households per square mile. That is plenty of population density for an internet provider, sometimes more than one internet provider, to be able to make back their investment when they install like a bunch of fiber optic cable or a bunch of coax running to houses for cable providers. They'll get enough subscribers that they can justify the expense for that. The problem comes down to what we call the rural expanse, where you're getting into places that are less than 2% the density of Columbus. Like all of Meigs County is just 26 households per square mile. A lot of the small townships that you look at, they're getting down below 10 households per square mile. And at that level, you're not going to find any company that's willing to invest in the infrastructure to make broadband happen there because they just won't get enough subscribers to make back that investment. This is not a new problem. About a century ago, government recognized that there needed to be subsidy to get communications into rural areas. From 1934, all people in the United States shall have access to rapid, efficient, nationwide communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges. Now, they were talking about old school landline telephones back then, but that law is still around, and that wording applies just as well to broadband today as it did to landline phones 100 years ago. And in fact, since 1990, the FCC has given about $100 billion to the big telecommunications companies to supposedly fix the problem. And if you're living in one of the places in Ohio that doesn't have broadband, you know that that really hasn't happened yet. I like to use roads as a good metaphor for this. If you stop maintaining your roads for a couple of years, you're going to get some potholes. Wait a few more years, they're going to be car eaters of potholes. If you stop maintaining those roads for a couple of decades, you're going to wind up with a little four-wheeler track, and people aren't going to be able to drive down it anymore unless they have a really aggressive vehicle. That's pretty much what has happened in our region with our internet infrastructure. Much of internet connectivity in rural Ohio runs over copper phone lines that were put in about a half century ago. And at the time, it was great technology. It was done well. It used some of that money from the Communications Act to do it. But in the intervening decades, things changed. People started dropping their landlines in favor of cell phones. The phone companies who own the infrastructure didn't see any point in investing in it. So at this point, it's now 50 years old. Copper is usually good for about 30. So it's 20 years past the end of its life, and there is basically no maintenance being done on it. So the area has been abandoned in terms of fixing that infrastructure. To stick with the road metaphor for a bit, if you're going to do a highway and get federal funding for it, there are a ton of specifications you have to follow. If you print them out, you're ending up with something about this thick with all of the information. Like you have to specify all of the different layers you're going to use, what the materials are, how they're bound together, what you're going to put on as a top coat. You can't just say, oh yeah, we're going to run a bulldozer down this valley and then pour some asphalt and call it good. Unfortunately, with broadband, there aren't a whole lot of specifications. You can basically just say, we're going to deliver this speed target, and that's pretty much it. There's no concern in there for how long the stuff you put in is going to last or how much capacity it has for the future. And that can be an issue. To give you a sense of perspective on why this matters, the web was invented back in 1990, and pretty much since then, every 10 years, demand has gone up about tenfold. So you were starting down below a megabit per second back in the 1990s. By 2000, if you were in a well-served region, you could expect to get about a megabit per second down. In 2010, when Zoom first came on the scene as a company, it was 10 megabits. The 25 megabit down, 3 megabit up standard that the FCC uses for broadband right now, That was what a well-served household would expect to get back in 2012. Today, right now, well-served households typically get about 100 megabits now. Where are we headed in the future? Nobody can say for sure, but looking at what's already happening, I think that trend is probably going to continue. Certainly, cable companies already are offering gigabit plans for homes. Some of them are even offering 2 gig plans. So that's already there. Places that offer gigabit service often see up to a third of their subscribers take that. In terms of what technologies can do right now, DSL and satellite and fixed wireless, most of what's deployed right now, that tops out at about 100 megabits per second, so it's good for now. It may have trouble keeping up in the future, though I have heard that there are technological advances happening with fixed wireless that will allow them to have 2 gig and up connections. Cable modems top out between 1 gig and 2 gigs right now, and cable modems have a real problem with upload speed. You can get pretty good download speed, but all of the cable infrastructure was built in a time when everything was consumption. You were downloading video, you weren't sending it back out on the internet. Now, of course, with remote work, remote school, telehealth, it's just as important to be able to send video out as it is to be able to receive it. Fiber optic is the only technology currently that could handle the speeds that we expect to see in 30 years. There are networks right now that are running at 100 gigabits per second on fiber in the cities. This is infrastructure you want to plan out multiple decades, like putting in a sewer system. You don't want to have to go back and dig up everybody's yards 5 years after you did your project because you didn't put in big enough pipes. Same thing with broadband. So we recommend that when you're looking at doing a big infrastructure investment, you should look at the window from about 2025 through about 2055, because that's the typical lifespan of the equipment and the cabling that you'd be putting in. And it takes a couple of years to get these projects done. You're not going to be able, if you had all the money you needed to serve an area tomorrow, you probably wouldn't be able to get that done if you were doing an internet build with fiber for a year or two, just because of supply and demand issues and the fact that it's a big construction project. That's not to say we should ignore short-term efforts. There are fixed wireless is a really great technology for deploying quickly. So if there are opportunities to partner with a fixed wireless provider to get some service out to folks who don't have it, it's definitely worth looking at. So when I talk about fiber optic, it's not all the same. You could have 2 different providers who both deliver something that is fiber to the home, but it will end up looking very different. The type of network we're talking about is a robust one, and it has several costs you have to keep track of. One of them is what they call make-ready. You're basically getting utility poles ready to have another cable installed on them. And that runs anywhere on average between $30,000 and $60,000 a mile, depending on which utility company you're talking to. Some rural co-ops could do it for much cheaper. When you talk to some of the regulated for-profit companies, it ends up being much more expensive. Then on top of that, you need to buy the fiber itself and pay the construction costs and the labor costs to install the fiber. That's another $32,000 to $40,000 a mile. Inflation will probably drive that up in the coming years if the trends continue the way they are now. So your total cost, you're looking at right now, $64,000 to $100,000 a mile. And when I drop this number, I'm talking about a fiber network that's capable of handling the demand for the next 30 to 40 years. It's possible to build a network in a rural area that doesn't have a whole lot of households out of really low-cost cable that they call drop cable. It's the cable that you run, they call it a drop. It's from like a utility pole to a house, and it typically only has a couple of strands of fiber in it. It's designed to just serve a few houses. You can get drop cables that have a bundle of fibers in them, and you could build an entire network with the current population density in those areas using just that inexpensive cable, and it would drop your construction costs quite a bit. But 2 things are going to happen. Once the word gets out that there is fiber broadband available, people are going to want to start moving to the region because remote work is a thing now, and our region is very attractive for folks to want to live there who don't want to be in a city. And secondly, you're going to have the next generation who's not going to be as likely to leave town because they're able to get work remotely. When that happens, your population density goes up, and then guess what? That inexpensive fiber network you put in doesn't have enough capacity to keep up. We also recommend using armored cable with a lot of strands in it, so you've got extra capacity. Squirrels love fiber optic cable for some reason. They like it even more than power lines. Maybe it's because they don't die when they bite into a fiber optic cable. But these cables are designed to deal with that. They chew on the insulation on the outside, then they hit like a Kevlar layer on the next level, and they don't like the way that feels, and they stop. And then there's another insulating layer underneath that that keeps the water from getting in, so that the cable's still good even though it got chewed on the outside. We're also assuming that this is going on utility poles. You can bury it, but when you bury around here, sometimes you run into bedrock, so that can drive up your cost because you either end up having to jump up onto a utility pole for a ways and then go back underground, or you just have to use a boring machine and it gets really expensive. So we're assuming underground would add another $10,000 to $50,000 per mile. To give you a little bit of sense of why make-ready costs so much, here's a graphic with a typical utility pole setup. You will have seen these when you drive around all the time. Those top lines are the higher voltage distribution lines, and there's a transformer in between. Then you have the second layer that has the drops that come off of it to serve each of the individual houses with their power. And then that third level down there with the thicker cables with those splice cases on them, that's the communication space. And by regulation, it can only be so close to the power space. You can't go up from there because they don't want the communications techs climbing up the poles and getting near the live wires. They don't want anybody getting killed or having to shut off the power every time they want to do work on the communications cables. There's also a minimum clearance from the ground that you have to maintain. And when you're in flat territory, flat countryside, it's not a big deal. You can add another cable and it usually doesn't affect anything. But in our beautiful countryside, we have hills. And oftentimes those undulations end up affecting how much clearance you have between the poles. Add another cable, suddenly you don't have enough clearance, you have to put in taller poles. Sometimes too, the poles are just too old, and even though fiber optic cable itself is not very heavy, in the winter it gets really heavy when it gets full of ice. So when they engineer these things, they look at the pole and they say, that pole's too old, it's going to snap if you put another cable on it come winter. And so you end up having to replace that pole. That's why this gets so expensive. Now I'd like to return to a regional overview. This is looking at the Omega District. You can see that the vast majority, pushing 80% of the square miles that have population in them, is unserved right now. About a third of the households. And again, this is all speed test related data. These lines that I just brought up on the map here show what we call middle mile fiber. For those of you all who are not familiar with that term, that's fiber optic cable that basically sits in between the main internet pipelines and the central offices for whatever internet providers are then serving the communities that they have customers in. So it sits in the middle. Without middle mile, you can't do what they call the last mile, which is running all of those cables down into individual households and along the roads in the neighborhoods. Belmont County has a pretty decent amount of open middle mile there. That's the dark blue. If you look in the northeastern corner, you'll see a pink line. That's some suggested additional middle mile that we could recommend putting in. There are some federal programs coming out that are designed specifically to fund middle mile, so that would be something that would be worth looking at. That would make the middle mile more accessible and also more reliable, since it would have multiple connections through the different counties. Kind of busy with all those colors. This is a simplified view that just shows in a single color all of the areas that are unserved. So all of that orange is below 25 megabits per second download, 3 megs up. The white areas are well served, and we just made them white so it would be less distracting. There is some money being distributed. Belmont did not receive any of this for charter. It's called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. The funds were awarded back in 2020 at the end of the year. They're just starting to get released now from the FCC. There were other providers, I believe, and we'll still have a slide later that'll show the providers in Belmont. But so far, Charter has been the only provider in our region that has shown any indication they're actually going to do the work. They are actually already bringing broadband to new customers in their RDOF territory over in Guernsey County. And we've heard from the utility providers that they are talking to them about attaching to their poles. But the other companies are not acting. Good news for Belmont, in the state grant program, the Ohio Residential Broadband Expansion Grant, South Central Power won a huge grant. It was the biggest grant in the state that was offered in this program for their western and their eastern territories, and their eastern territory includes a very large chunk of the unserved space in Belmont County. So that's a good sign. Assuming that their board of directors approves accepting the grant, which will be in a couple of weeks, they are likely to serve every single household that's in their territory. They won't just serve the addresses that they got the grant money for. They figure if they're gonna reach customers, they will reach all of their customers. There was also a bit of grant funding awarded to Comcast in Belmont County. We'll map that once Broadband Ohio releases the final address list. We represented South Central Power in that application, which is why we know where their territory is. But we will map all of the winners once Broadband Ohio releases the information. There is a lot of money out there. This is a good time to be looking at trying to expand broadband. The FCC has another phase of RDOF coming. We're hoping that they manage that better and that they have more teeth in it so that when they hand out the money, there is a reason to enforce it and actually make sure the providers install. They also have the Rural 5G Fund, which is designed to get more cell towers into the region. The USDA is in the broadband business, so is the Treasury Department. Appalachian Regional Commission has 2 different grant programs that they allow using it for broadband, the POWER program and their Distressed Counties program. Broadband Ohio, the office in the state that handles broadband expansion, they're doing a really good job. They already handed out $250 million in grants in their first round. There's going to be a whole bunch more money coming into that. The NTIA is going to have the lion's share of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act money from the federal government. That's going to be $1 billion to $1.5 billion for the state of Ohio. And there's another $270 million coming from the Treasury Department. That's all going to go through Broadband Ohio, so there will be additional rounds of their grant program for the state as well. In the meantime, here are some things that counties are actually doing to address the short-term need to reach people now, because again, these fiber projects are longer term. They take several years to complete. Coshocton County, for example, used their ARPA funds, which is COVID relief-related funding that went to townships and counties. One of the things, it was earmarked for infrastructure, and one of the things that was identified as infrastructure was broadband. So they pulled together their ARPA funds and took $5 million and made that available and put out a request for proposals for fixed wireless providers to come in and do broadband in the county. A company called Ohio TT won that. They are working with Coshocton County. They're planning on putting in 11 new towers, and then they're going to put antennas on 10 existing structures like water towers or existing radio towers. And according to Ohio TT, they will reach up to 15,000 households. The speeds will vary from 25 megabits up to 100 megabits, but it can be quick. They've already installed at least 1 antenna, and I believe they're working on more as we speak. Over in Carroll County, they have applied for an ARC Power grant from the Appalachian Regional Commission. So again, it was ARPA money that they brought to the table. In Carroll County's case, it was just over $1 million. They put out an RFP asking for an internet partner. In their case, Charter Communications, Spectrum Cable, they won that. Charter's kicking in another $874,000. That's basically $2 million, and then they're asking the ARC to match them with another $2 million, so they have $4 million total. And this will reach portions of Carroll County that are both currently unserved and not scheduled to get any significant help from the federal government. At this point, I'd like to zoom in onto Belmont County itself. And I assume this is a decent level of zoom for the room. So the page 1 of our broadband profile for the county shows that color-graded speed map with the middle mile superimposed over it. You can see that just over a third of the households in the county do not have access to 25.3. That's about 6,000 households. It's 3/4 of your populated square miles. So about 376 square miles don't have access to broadband right now. To look at it from another perspective, business locations. So we were able to obtain Dun & Bradstreet data for the whole county. That gave us a list of every operating business, how many employees they have, and what industry sector they're located in and what their location is. So we mapped all those locations. Those are the blue dots here on this map. And again, with this simplified coverage view, the orange is unserved, the white is already served. So you see that there are a lot of businesses, although the dots really overlap in many of the white areas. Makes sense. But there are also sections of the county that have businesses located in them that do not have good internet. Southwest corner has quite a few businesses down there. There's also pockets in other portions of the county as well. And the dot sizes are different on here intentionally. The bigger the dot, the bigger the demand we would expect that business to have. So if you are, let's say you're a healthcare provider, you have 50 employees, you're going to need a lot more broadband than a construction contractor that has 50 employees. Now, it's not to say the contractor doesn't need broadband, but the healthcare clinic is probably going to have all 50 of those employees walking around all day doing stuff on iPads and laptops and having to talk to cloud servers with their patient records and transferring x-ray images and things like that. Whereas the construction company, they might have 2 or 3 people who are in the office all day who need to be on the internet, but then the other 37 or 47 employees are all out in the field on projects. So we varied the dot size based on both the industry and how many employees a business had. This is designed to help county officials, local officials plan to figure out where do we want to target areas to try to get more subsidy to bring broadband in. You can overlay your business coverage and the business demand with the unserved layers to figure that out. You can also combine it with residential data. This map shows where all of the households are located. Now, this is not all 32,000 households in the county. There's just no way you can show that many dots and have them be visible. But we did figure out a way to be able to provide something that shows the pattern of where the houses are distributed. So again, if you look in that southwestern corner of the county, you got a decent number of households for a rural area. And you also, if you remember from the previous map, you had a number of businesses there. So that would be a good place to focus on. Another map, again, orange is unserved, white is served. This one has in the dark blue, that's the middle mile that's available currently. And then all of those smaller dark lines are all of the roads in the county that pass through unserved census blocks. The reason we bothered to map those is that that's a really good way to figure out how much fiber you need if you wanted to do a full fiber optic network throughout the county. Because typically you have to follow the roads when you're doing a fiber network, and most of the utility lines follow the roads as well. So if you're attaching to their poles, you want to follow those roads. That comes out to about 876 miles of unserved roads. So basically that's how much fiber you would need to purchase and install if you wanted to do the whole unserved portion of Belmont County. And of course that will change as grant programs come up and providers install areas, and that number will go down. These budget numbers assume that we're going to do the entire county, all of its unserved space, and again, it's a network that's designed to hold up for the next 40 years. It has extra capacity. It's got the good high quality cable. You're looking at about $79 million total to do the whole county, and that would reach 11,000 households. It's about 12, almost 13 households per square mile. With that level of population density, we figure internet providers would be willing to kick in about $1,700 of their own money per household. So that would drop it down by almost 20 million, but you're still looking at a funding gap of just under 60 million. So to get a subsidy, you would need about $5,300 per household to be able to do that. And that is within reason. A number of the grant programs that the state just awarded are above that, like they're $6,000, $7,000 a household. So it is possible to obtain that kind of funding. Earlier I mentioned the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund and how I was saying that there were a number of providers that we didn't think were going to do anything. This map shows all of the providers who received coverage in that auction back in 2020 to bring fiber to Belmont County. The pale kind of grayish blue is a company called Connect Everyone. The darker blue is a company called Mercury Wireless, and then the pink is LTD Broadband. Connect Everyone and Mercury Wireless are both companies who do primarily wireless stuff. In their grant proposals, they said they would do fiber. They've never done fiber that we're aware of. And they have not done anything really to follow up on their awards yet. Like utility companies have not heard from them yet. Mercury Wireless, some of their money looks like it might get approved by the FCC coming up, but we're not sure how they're going to pull this off because they've got a really scattershot coverage all over the state, and it'd be really expensive and difficult to do a fiber network when you're trying to just connect these little dots rather than do contiguous areas. Connect Everyone got a lot of nice contiguous coverage in Belmont County, but again, we haven't heard much from them. And they're a company out of Denver that specializes in doing urban wireless. So they look for apartment buildings or office complexes that have poor service, and then they put an antenna on the roof of that building, and they go find another place in the city that has good coverage, and they beam coverage into that building over an antenna, and then they run cable in the building and serve people that way. They've never done rural stuff that we're aware of. They may end up following through and doing their commitment. If they do, great. But so far, that has not happened. So the state, for their grant program, is treating all of this territory as fair game for state funding to be handed out. I'm not going to read you all of this methodology here from our report, but I did want you to make sure that you're aware that it's there. If you want to read how we got these coverage areas assigned, we wanted to be above board and transparent about how that was done, so all of that information is in here. I will highlight this section for a moment. When I was talking about those business broadband dots on the map, here are the industry factors that we used. So the really big consumers for broadband: healthcare, education, TCOM, IT, banking, and then when you get down even, it's still like hospitality, which is like hotels. They need decent broadband because they've got everybody trying to use Wi-Fi while they're in their rooms. Wholesalers in the middle, transportation. It's when you get down into the low demand ones are like mining, contractors, energy production, farming. Some folks always say, farming, why do they need broadband? The digital age has come to farming as well. Dairy farms, all of their milking equipment often is remotely managed. It talks to cloud services in order to make sure that the cows are being treated properly and that they're happy and productive. Same thing with farming. A lot of times the tractors have automated systems on them that need to communicate back to an internet server to identify the patterns they're doing as they plow the fields. So broadband is pretty much, the need is everywhere these days. Again, I won't go through this again since I already covered it earlier, but we have a very detailed section on how we estimated these costs and the distances. Some details on why we were suggesting aerial rather than going underground. Simplified version of that historical graphic showing the bandwidth demands come up. That's really useful when you're talking to funding agencies, and if they ask you, why are you speccing this really high-end network? And that's where you can pull this out and say, because we're expecting demand to go up, we don't want to just be serving the things for today, since this is basically a once-in-a-generation or possibly once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And then finally, just a breakdown on how we did the math for the budgets. At this point, I will be happy to take questions either from folks in the room or online. All right, if we have no questions, thank you for your time today. I am optimistic about things for our region. I think when you look at our area 5 years from now, things will look very different. There are good things already happening here. Belmont County has some fiber coming in from a company called Ohio Gig. So there is progress, and we expect to see much more.